Hey, it's Stuart Robertson at ShareBuilder 401k, and I'm here to talk to you about 401k plans and how they became the retirement benefit of choice for us here in America. You're going to hear a little bit about how it's partly by accident, how it partly is just the evolution of our society, and partly how today's 401k is not your dad's 401k. It has changed quite a bit to meet the needs of most Americans. So let's jump to 1776 as we're becoming our own country and going through the Revolutionary War. We get past the Revolutionary War. Obviously, people didn't live nearly as long as they live today. You also had a situation where most people were farmers and lived off the land. So you had a great deal of the population who really didn't have access to a company work plan like we think about it today. And it really wasn't until 1875 that the first private pension plan, those things that we all hear about the news, that how great they were, started to exist. A lot of the industries that started picking up pensions, which became more popular as the Industrial Revolution happened, and you had all these people moving into cities, working, more jobs, living longer, or in actually more dangerous business as well. Mining and railroading was very dangerous. So a lot of times these pension plans were really designed for those who physically couldn't do their jobs anymore or had an injury. But it was really a big company benefit for the most part, and there were many flaws in it, and it had to evolve. In 1900, the average age that you lived to was 47 years old. So I wouldn't even be here telling you this story because I would already have passed. But you think about that, and then by 1950, it was already 68, and today it's closer to 80. So you can really see how our lifetimes and our quality of life haven't improved. How we think about the world has changed. And then the Great Depression happened in 1929, and in 1935, we started Social Security because it was so evident we had no backstop for people, especially of age, to at least even be able to feed themselves. So, as I kind of mentioned earlier, 1900, we were living to be 47. Well, but by 1950, average American was living to be to 68. So now this whole thinking about, hey, maybe I can afford a retirement. We're getting wealthier as a country. Individuals are. How do I want to live my life? Some thoughts about having retirement started to evolve. More big companies started offering pensions, but even they were flawed. You read stories of companies that had them. They went out of business. There was no backstop for them, and people thought they had a pension, and that company was gone. And now they didn't. And then in the 1970s, more and more companies started having pensions, but they also became really troublesome to manage. The problem with pensions, this is economics. And it's about, hey, a pension when they first started, by the way, didn't cover a lot of people. People would work at a company for 20, 30 years. And by the way, if you didn't get access to the pension. So it wasn't meeting some Americans' needs on that front. But really the biggest problem for companies and why you've seen them step back from pensions is how long we are living. I mentioned we were at 68 years of age in 1950. We're living about 80 now. And a pension was really meant to cover 2 to 5 years of an employee post-retirement. We're living way longer. So now these pensions need to cover 15, 30 years and sometimes more of an employee's life on average. And managing that is a real problem. So how do you keep that funded? How do you keep it invested to get the payout that's expected from the pension? You see the same problem with Social Security. There's probably more around that, but those are things that are really difficult to manage, and it becomes a big liability on the company's ability to invest in itself, to keep growing, to pay its current employees. All those sort of things become a problem for companies as we live longer and longer, and people are in retirement longer and longer. In comes 1978. Congress is in there. They pass this act, and in that is this little subsection, and you probably can't guess the name of it. It's 401k. I'd love to tell you there was some beautiful reason of how 401k became this popular term, but it's actually this silly little name for a section of retirement act. But in that became the genesis of the 401k, and it really wasn't meant to be, that third leg of the stool. It wasn't meant to be the employer retirement benefit of choice in America, and I think many of you probably know that. Companies were a little hesitant to jump on this bandwagon in 78, and it really took some additional legislation in the 1980s, early 1980s, that made companies feel safe about adding this 401k feature. And the great thing about the 401k, obviously, is that you get to save tax deferred. At least back then, that was your only option. You save tax deferred, the employer provided a match, and it helped you basically grow money tax free until you used it in retirement. And this actually did take the liability off of a company of having to figure out how to fund your 30 years in retirement, we hope, to the employee. So Yeah, you got this money, it grew tax deferred, but yeah, now you have to understand investments or at least some concept of it. That was really kind of the beginning of it. But it had lots of flaws. It was not ready to be prime time, and it did not become prime time. So let's talk about how 401ks evolved. How did they need to change as companies started adopting these rapidly to replace pensions or at least supplement their pensions and do less in their pension? How did this come to be? What you're going to start seeing is that some legislation starts occurring. So 1986 was a big one. It really kind of put in some IRS tests with some boring names you don't want to know, but basically ensure that highly compensated employees aren't the ones only benefiting from the 401k plan. It's really meant to ensure that anyone that chooses to participate in it is taking advantage of it and making the most of it versus it just being for highly compensated employees. But it still was a big company benefit, just like pensions were. So you need to do something else. And that kind of drove in this safe harbor element in 1996, which basically allows small businesses to not have to worry about the test because it requires some immediately vesting match, but it makes it simple for them to manage. So now you can actually drive access down market to smaller businesses to offer the benefit. Love it, right? We've got smaller businesses covered, but there's still plenty of problems to solve to make the 401k great, right? So one of those things is that, hey, we've got this offering, but people aren't signing up the way you think they'd sign up. Actually, participation rates could be really low. So in 2000, there was some legislation that enabled auto enrollment, which basically would put every employee into the 401k plan, and then they could opt out. The next big item was really around catch-up contributions. Many Americans don't start saving in their 401k when they're 22 or had access to it or what have you. They get started late, they're behind, they need to catch up. So that's the whole intent of this catch-up contribution. Once you turn 50, you can put more into the 401k plan than someone who's younger than you, and that's fully meant for that reason. So a great ad in 2001, and then drum roll, the famous Roth 401k comes into existence in 2006. Roth IRAs have gotten popular. You know, it's the concept that you put money in after tax. Then when you pull back in retirement, it's not taxed at all, including earnings. So it's a pretty big deal. And it has none of the requirements that can restrict a Roth IRA. It doesn't matter how much you earn, you can put money into the Roth 401k. So pretty big deal and pretty exciting offering to start rounding out what people might need as they think about how to manage money in retirement. And now we get to 2022. And there's been some changes along the way to 401k plans that I'm glossing over, but 2022 was a pretty big deal because at the very end of the year, Secure Act 2.0 came into being. And it's a real win for small businesses. So the tax credits now, when a company's starting their first 401k plan, can cover pretty much 100% of their costs in terms of setup and admin, and even tax credits for any contributions they may want to do in their 401k plan. In 2025, automatic enrollment's going to be required in every plan, so that's going to get more people covered. So that's a great thing. Employers are going to be able to match in Roth. They've always had to do it tax deferred. You as an employee could choose Roth or not, but the employer had to do tax deferred. That's changing. So there's some really exciting things here going on to get people access to the plans, more small businesses access to plans, getting the money the way you want it for how you want to manage your money in retirement, either tax deferred or not. And there's lots of things I haven't mentioned that are really exciting. Like, if you're self-employed, we're a much more gig economy than we've been in decades, right? And they actually can have a solo 401k plan. It's meant for that sole prop individual, and they can take advantage of those high contribution limits that are so popular in the 401k plan. You may be worried about access to money as an emergency. Well, there's 401k loans. There's even some changes in hardship withdrawals that can help. So there's a lot of ways that a 401k plan has that flexibility. It has really evolved, not to be your dad's old 401k, but really to be the one that can meet most Americans' needs. And that's pretty darn exciting. Here's to you. Here's to a happy, comfortable retirement. Hope you're kicking back on the beach when it's your time and enjoying some life and sipping some wine. Take care. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for some more exciting content around retirement, investing, and ways to save smarter for tomorrow.